Hello and welcome to 5 Minutes of Postgres. My name is Lucas and today we're going to talk about new features in Postgres 15, including logical replication improvements and database-wide ICU locales. In case you're not aware, Postgres 15 RC1 is around the corner and we can expect the final release of Postgres 15 within the next couple of weeks. On this blog post by Vignesh from the Fujitsu team, he describes how you can use column lists in logical replication to restrict which data gets sent into the logical replication stream. The essence of the feature is that when you have a create publication statement on the primary, now you can actually specify a list of columns from that table that should be included in the publication. One thing to know with this is that at least you need to include all the replica identity columns in the publication. If they weren't included, update or delete operations wouldn't have a reference to attach to. This also means if you're using replica identity full, the new feature doesn't really help you because you can't specify a subset of a column list because all the columns are important or part of the replica identity. Now, the way this works is, for example, we can say create publication for table employee, and we can say ID, name, email as the columns. And so in this case, other columns like date of birth or which department they're in would be skipped. On the subscriber, you could actually have these columns existing, but they would need to be nullable. Now, another example here would be in the case of a table called student. You can see the different columns being passed. And in this situation, the subscriber actually does not have these columns existing at all. So you can now have a table definition on the subscriber that differs from publisher's definitions, and that works as expected. This is actually very useful because previously you always had to keep a lot of unnecessary data around. Additionally, it will help you provide only relevant data to the subscriber. Oftentimes you're only analyzing a subset of your table's information. This will reduce network traffic. So you can now send less data over the network as part of the replication stream. If you have a very large column that you don't need, you can now skip over that. And last but not least, there are sometimes security impacts to copying your own data. For example, if you had a users table, you may not want to copy around your hashed password, but it can be helpful to have users' emails in different parts of your environment. And so now with the new logical replication column filters, you can say all the users' ID, email, and skip over all the other user columns. So overall, I think this will make logical replication a lot more useful for more use cases and avoid manual replication tool like that people use today. The second feature I want to talk about are database-wide ICU collations in Postgres 15. ICU support was added back in Postgres 10. And if you're not familiar, ICU collations matter, for example, for sorting. When you're sorting the rows in a table, you do this according to certain rules, and this can be language specific. In German, for example, you might have the German umlauts, and they will influence how certain things are ordered. Traditionally, this was done using glibc, and glibc or libc had various issues around different versions causing potential database corruption because they weren't really explicit about when the sorting changed between different library versions. ICU is much more featureful, and it also has more explicit versioning around when it changes. Now with Postgres 15, what we can do is we can use a certain ICU locale for the whole database, making sure that the ICU versioning that also influences how things are sorted now applies consistently throughout our database. There are actually still some cases where you do have to use the libc locale. These are some leftovers, for example, in the text church code. And so today, Postgres 15, whilst you can default to the ICU locale for essentially most of the database, you still have to specify a libc locale at this point. This is actually something that Peter, who's worked on these features in Postgres, is going to address in future releases. Overall, I think for a lot of use cases, this will make ICU more widely available and more useful to people. Thank you so much for listening. This was 5 Minutes of Postgres. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear about next week's episode, and talk to you next week.